You think of person who is not part of that community arriving in that community to hurt that community. But active shooters are actually the opposite. They tend to be from that region. You know, the Las Vegas shooter was from a town nearby called Mesquite. And the San Bernardino shooter was from San Bernardino. The Newtown shooter was from Newtown. And so, you know, the Orlando shooter was from Orlando. So Boston Marathon, you know, the same thing. They were in that area. So it's interesting that this is something where they plan and prep by knowing the area pretty well.
Yeah, and you mentioned terrorism. And so one of the things that the study looked at as well was primary grievances. So what was their motive that at least that the FBI was able to determine?
Right.
And by watching the news, you kind of get this idea that a big part of this is political or ideological based. And that was one of the big takeaways from this that I learned, is that that's actually a very, very small percentage. Actually, 7% had some kind of grievance that was based in ideology or extremism.
Right, because you sort of imagine that there's going to be a manifesto and it's going to be like, you know, I Heil Hitler, you know, or something crazy like that. But the study not only said that's extremely rare, but it said, and this is another thing, either in my mind, the stereotype I had was either A, they have a manifesto, or B, they're completely unprovoked, right? I thought it was spontaneous. I thought it just happened like in the night. They saw a crazy commercial and they just went and did this. But really what the study says is that as many as 79% of them had some kind of primary grievance. And I actually wanted to read this, Nick. I highlighted this in the study because this was a line that I thought was really well worded. And so what the FBI did is they sort of explain what is meant by the word grievance. And the way this was phrased I thought was so indicative. A grievance is defined for the study as the cause of the active shooter's distress or resentment, a perception, not necessarily based in reality, of having been wronged or treated unfairly or inappropriately. More than a typical feeling of resentment or passing anger, a grievance often results in a grossly distorted preoccupation with a sense of injustice, like an injury that fails to heal. These thoughts can saturate a person's thinking and foster a pervasive sense of imbalance between self-image and the real or perceived humiliation.
Which ties in very closely to road rage.
Yes.
Road rage is a lot of the same thing, where it's this idea of this perceived injustice. I was wronged, and this lack of communication between me and the driver of this other car. I automatically assume intent, and there's this sense of I can't do anything about it. This person's going to get away with it, and there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, it's like a powerlessness, and that actually went to the final big debunked myth. I always thought the targets were random. It just looks like there's so much carnage. How could it possibly be premeditated? How could you have had a person in mind when you showed up to that place? But actually, the study said that like 64% of those who end up getting injured, they had a target in mind. The shooter, 64% of the time, had intended to at least hit this type of person, or this is where they wanted to hit. They don't like this people that work at this company, or people that are, in fact, children and are at this school, or people that are at that nightclub that fit a certain type. They are trying to hurt that group for a perceived grievance that they have against that group. And I found that fascinating.
Yeah. Now that still does leave 1/3 of them that
we don't know.
They don't know.
Yeah.
Right? That would appear completely random.
So another thing that came out of the study that I really want to circle into, the FBI identified – now again, it was hard to identify huge predictors, right, because they were saying, hey, demographically, these folks don't look different than the average American. But one thing the FBI zoomed into was this idea of stressors. So they said there are these stressors that we all encounter in life, and that's fine, and we learn to cope with our stress and our life conditions. But what was common among the shooters – they tended to have on average about 3.6 significant life stressors. And all of these things would be happening at once. And it would cause this sort of overload where the person would sort of snap and then excise their grievance at a target and then go on the shooting rampage. So they actually published, the FBI published this list of the stressors. And what I want to do, Nick, is I want you and I to sort of unpack each of these in order, starting with the one that was least common, all the way up to the one that was most common, and then we can sort of unpack that. So starting at the bottom of this list, death of a friend or relative was noticed in about 6%. 6% of the shooters had that as a stressor.
Right. Civil problems identified as 10%.
Yeah, criminal problems. And this is another thing. We think, oh, they're all criminals. Well, no, only 11% of them we were able to identify, the FBI was able to identify that only 11% of them had a criminal problem as a stressor in their life, in the sense that they're entangled in the legal system. So 11% of them had that, though.
Sexual frustration or sexual stress. It was identified as 13%.
Which is interesting because you don't always think about that. But there's that incel movement, the involuntarily celibate, who say that they can't, get into a relationship. So that's something to think about. Another stressor next on the list was conflict. Conflict with family members specifically was noticed 16% of the time.
And then conflict with parents 18% of the time. They separated parents from other family members.
21% of the time, the person was having a life stressor of encountering some kind of physical injury, which was somehow causing them some kind of pain.
Conflict at school at 22%.
Which is fascinating because other kinds of conflict, like with having a caregiving responsibility, something that is sort of like a miscellaneous, uncategorized life stressor, they noticed that about 22% of the time.
Same as abuse for illicit drugs or alcohol is 22%.
And it's easy to think that's not an issue, but we're talking almost 1/5 or over 1/5 of them had some kind of abusive substances. Marital problems were noticed in the shooter 27% of the time.
And conflicts with friends or peers 29% of the time.
35% of the time they would have some kind of job-related stressor where they're losing their job, they're in fear of losing their job, or they've just lost their job, or they're just having conflict.
And 49%, nearly half, were financial strain.
Yeah, and that's a huge stressor too, because we think about economics and we fail to understand that economics affects all of this. But here was the king, okay? The number one biggest stressor. 62% of the time, the FBI found that the shooter had a significant life stressor inside of the issue of mental health. Now, obviously, you probably saw that coming because this is a pod therapy show. We're going to talk about that. But what we need to understand is, what does the FBI mean by that? So the FBI says, listen, of that category of people, right, only 25% of that 62% had a diagnosed mental illness, had a label of some kind of actual diagnosis. But what they mean is they saw in those people signs of depression, anxiety, or paranoia. And so that large number of folks, 62% of them, had exhibited symptoms of depression, paranoia, or anxiety. And of those, only 25% had a diagnosis. Now, that's gigantic, and we need to reflect on that. But for me, Nick, another thing that this addressed is what I call the Joker hypothesis. Because based on Batman and Arkham Asylum and all this stuff, we think that the person who's going to do mass crime is quote-unquote insane or quote-unquote crazy, right? They're the Joker. They have no reason. Some men just want to watch the world burn. But what this teaches us is that these people didn't have psychosis. They didn't have schizophrenia. They weren't unconnected to reality on its terms. They had a grievance, and they had a lot of life stressors, and then they had a low mental immune system because they were experiencing depression, paranoia, or anxiety.
Right. What we would refer to as resiliency. Also one of the big factors leading to the determination of who is more likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder or get diagnosed with that. Not only is it the exposure to a traumatic event, but it's also the resiliency that the individual has.
Yeah, and 50% of these people had some kind of suicidal ideation. So we can see that they've become self-destructive, they are unhealthy, they're depressed, they're anxious, they're paranoid, they are low resiliency, and then these other life stressors happen. They develop a grievance, some kind of unrealistic resentment of another person or entity, and then they feel like they need to exact justice.
So to kind of summarize, I think what you're saying is it's not this idea of somebody with schizophrenia who goes out and shoots.
Right. It's not the Joker hypothesis.
Right. It's somebody with most likely some other form of mental illness, depression, anxiety, mixed with or in addition to multiple stressors going on. Yes. The average was 3.6 stressors per shooter, not just one thing.
Yeah, and we all go through this stuff, but we have coping skills. We have resiliency, or we go see a therapist. Mm-hmm. These are people where they didn't have any of those things, and they never did those things. And then they plot and they plan, and that's their relief. Their relief from the pain is to imagine exacting some kind of violent justice. That's the fantasy they begin entertaining, and eventually they act that out. So guys, this is grim data, but it's valuable data. It's something I want other people to hear. I want you to share this podcast because it's important that we all begin to know what are the signs and symptoms. And if you know somebody in your life who has depression, who has anxiety, who seems paranoid, who's going through a significant amount of life distress, guys, if you notice these warning signs, you shouldn't think in your head they're the next shooter, right? That's like as rare as a lightning strike.
Right.
But the good news is that whether they're the next shooter or whether they're just your coworker, colleague, or friend, the answer that you should have is the same. Hey, have you thought about seeing a therapist? Hey, here's a list of therapists in our area. Hey, we both work at the same place. Did you know that there's a list of therapists that take our insurance? Buddy, I'd really like to see you go check in with somebody. I worry about you. You don't seem like you're very healthy right now. No matter what, that is actually the right way to address that.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we will discuss online therapy. You're listening to Pod Therapy.
We're back. You're listening to Pod Therapy, and it's time to dive into our listener mail. All right, the first question is, what are your thoughts on internet therapy? Hi, guys. First, I wanted to say I love the podcast.
Hi, Mom.
Yeah, we love you too. I heard you on Ice Cream Social. Oh, cool.
What do you
Hey,
know?
it's a scoop. Right on. Come to Scoop Fest. I heard you on Ice Cream Social, and I've binged all the back episodes. God bless you. Wow. I wouldn't wish that torture on anybody. Did you decide...
Especially episode 5.
Yeah. Did you decide on a name for your listeners? I have to agree with Paul Mattingly that Therapals is perfect. Yes, we are
that
leaning
one.
in that direction. I've been trying to advocate for theropods, Nick, because the dinosaur thing is
Theropod,
cool, but
yeah.
Therapal's catching on, so I don't know. Now for the backstory. I've been in therapy off and on for the last 12 years. I have depression and generalized anxiety disorder due to a childhood sexual abuse, parental rejection, low self-esteem, and weight issues. Therapy, along with the antidepressant and anti-anxiety medications, have been wonderful and gave me tools to work through panic attacks and intrusive thoughts. I recently went through a few weeks of feeling really low and knew I should go back to therapy. The problem is I have new insurance since my last therapy session, and I can no longer go see the same therapist. I tried setting up an appointment with the new therapist, but I can't get in for weeks due to their schedule. My question is, what are your thoughts about online therapy services? I'm considering going this route due to the convenience. I just need to talk things out and get some advice and guidance on some new stress that has occurred in my life. Thanks for the help.
My take on that is any access to therapy is going to be good.
Yes. Yes.
Just as a bottom line,
Yes.
that first things first, accessing it, any access to it is going to be good. So, I don't have any issues with it. I think one of the challenges, probably more for the therapist than for the patient or client, is you do lose a little bit of the connection when you're not physically in the same room.
Sure.
But other than that, I don't see it as being a problem.
Yeah, and I would actually argue this. So I've done both. Okay, as a therapist, I've done face-to-face. I've done over the phone where I can't see them. I've done Skype where I actually can see them and I'm working on it. So I've done all of that, right? What I can tell you is this. There's sometimes it's different. I wouldn't say one's better than the other. When I'm talking to somebody on the phone and I can't see them, there's actually an advantage to that, Nick. And I remember once I came in your office and told you what my patient had told me, which was he said he found himself being much more honest. Because whenever he saw me face to face, he saw me staring at him, right? And there was a desire to sort of perform. But when he was talking to me over the phone, he felt like he could just tell his truth and he can't see my reaction. So it forced him to just sort of be honest about what was going on. And I've also done Skype and, versions of that work in the therapy world where I can see the other person and I'm talking to them. But I would say, honestly, I echo Nick's point. There is no wrong door to getting help, okay? There's a lot of people hesitate. That's the wrong answer. Hesitating or failing to go forward because you're worried you're going to do the wrong thing is exactly the wrong thing to do. Step forward into help. And, a couple of folks that I would reference to you, betterhelp.com, very, very good website, talkspace.com. Both of those are reputable. They contract with real licensed therapists. They will only link you to a therapist in your area. Therapists aren't really allowed to practice over state lines.
That was going to be my question.
Yeah, and so BetterHelp And Talkspace are really reputable because they intentionally only contract with therapists in your area. And it's a therapist just like me who's seeing clients in person too, but then I might book a few on Talkspace. And so if there was a reason why you needed to come see me face to face, I do exist. I'm in your